In the realm of medical education, where data science meets healthcare, stands our first guest, Nate Verhagen, co-founder of the Data Science Interest Group at the Medical College of Wisconsin. With his AI patient simulator, ChatClinic, Nate is revolutionizing how medical students learn, bridging theory and practice. Join us in welcoming what we see as an architect of tomorrow's healthcare training. Nate Verhagen, onto our podcast. And I guess we can get started. So do you mind just telling us a little bit about your journey into like the AI space as a medic?
Yeah, I think it's a great place to start. So I'm currently a third year at the Medical College of Wisconsin, located in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in the United States. Um, I did not have a background in data science going into medical school. It was something that I would say is kind of serendipitous, where I just met a mentor. And my mentor, his name is Dr. Anaya Katari. He's a surgical oncologist. And when I first got connected with him, I was told to meet with this guy who had an interest in surgical data science and machine learning. I had never uttered those words in my life until 4 years ago. Um, and so honestly, I was a little bit hesitant to actually take that interview with him. But kind of after meeting him and like what a good mentor I could sense he was, I kind of just jumped into data science. And from there, the rest has been history. I think right when I started medical school, it was kind of the peak of COVID-19. So there was a lot of research being conducted in that space. And me and my lab kind of really tried to do our best to research that space, and that involved a lot of data science using the National COVID Cohort Collaborative. I put out a bunch of publications regarding surgical outcomes relating to that. And that's kind of like the start of my data journey. And then kind of as large language models like ChatGPT have kind of increased in popularity, I've tried to just learn about the space. And I'm no expert, but I think conceptually, I've tried to take advantage of things as best as I can, understand the language, become literate in the area. So that's kind of my background. And there's a book. I guess I can talk about this now, but there's a book called Outliers. It's by Malcolm Gladwell. I don't know if you've heard of it, but there's this chapter for me that sticks out. I guess part of my motivation and interest in data science and AI is part of that book, where they talk about how each kind of generation has this opportunity to really jump into something new that can revolutionize how we do things. And for me, I see that as AI and data science. And despite not having a background in it, I do think we are in a ripe age where this can potentially really change how we do things. So I'm really excited by that, and I'm always willing to learn.
Right, great. I mean, we'll move on to the first theme that we want to address with you. In particular, it's about medical training and the current landscape of data within the medicine space right now. And so we want to understand, like, how is data already being used in medicine today? Like, where are the current data literacy standards of the average doctor, and where do you see that kind of going in the future?
Right. So data drives all industries, especially medicine. I think that's why there's a push, at least I really see there's a value in being literate within data. And that's kind of why I wanted to start the data science interest group at the Medical College of Wisconsin, because developing the educational infrastructure to ultimately kind of harness those skills needed, even just the understanding. It doesn't even have to be a crazy skill. You just need to know how to talk in those spheres and understand, the importance of data. So obviously in medicine, data is huge, especially with research, but also insurance. And I think the insurance component of it really drives a lot of the financial aspects of medicine, and money moves a lot of things, as you guys probably know, especially with politics. So actually in the United States, we recently passed a law called the Price Transparency Law, which actually forces hospital systems to disclose how much money they're charging for their services. And previously, they kind of had a monopoly in a way. And ultimately, this law forces hospital systems to disclose, this data that they previously would not show the consumer. So I think there's a lot of different barriers that we experience with data in medicine, and I think data everywhere. So I think just being aware of how that stuff works is so critical in medicine, and that's something I'm trying to learn about.
Is this something that universities are picking up on, or is this why you're taking your own initiative to do this yourself, because you see they're kind of missing out on that? They're not really teaching you the necessary skills that you need.
I think it's a little bit of both. I think there was a huge uptick in people going into software engineering, as you guys probably know, in the past couple of years. So a lot of colleges have taken note of it. But I think, in medicine, we're maybe a little bit behind in that. I think like data is driving everything. I think if I talk to my fellow classmates, who now are trying to do research, all research requires some knowledge of data, and all research requires some knowledge of analytics and like using R or Python to actually analyze this data. So while we all, or a lot of us, do not have backgrounds in it, we all actually try to learn it at some point. So the fact that we don't have actually like a structure to learn this is, I think, something that's lacking, which is why I'm trying to get involved and see if we can develop something at our school. But obviously, I think just with the growing interest, I think this will be something that will continue to grow nationwide and internationally.
Yeah, yeah. And actually, in particular, ChatClinic is trying to. The interesting aspect about ChatClinic is you're imitating patients, right? And it's kind of like a training mechanism for doctors. Do you see that mechanism growing in the future? Do you see it getting more sophisticated? Right now, we played around with it. Super, super impressive, by the way. But do you see it getting more sophisticated where the symptoms become a bit more, you have imagery involved as well? Maybe you have a video, someone to interact with on the screen. I mean, how do you see that kind of fleshing out?
Yeah, no, I think those are all great ideas. Maybe I'll take them. No, but I think those are things that people have brought up before, and I think they're super exciting. I mean, the realm of simulated interaction is one that a lot of people want to take advantage of, but I think there's a lot of hurdles that still exist. I think it's pretty easy to create a simulated interaction. I'm sure a lot of people have played around with similar ideas, but there's a lot of hurdles that currently exist. One being, where is the knowledge being pulled from? So when you're trying to simulate really complex conditions, the lack of specificity in your prompt can ultimately mislead someone. And ultimately, that's kind of a danger that ultimately, if a student is using our ChatClinic, right, and it gives wrong information, then that student learns the wrong information that ultimately can impact patients. So I think that kind of risk is something we always are trying to mitigate. I think there's methods of mitigation. So for example, one of the great things about using things like ChatGPT is the flexibility that it offers. Previously there were always patient simulators. They've always existed kind of in different ways, but they're more like point A to point B, more I don't know, like waterfall-y, if that's a word, where, if you select this, then it goes to this, then it goes to this. Versus now that what we have with ChatClinic, it's extremely flexible. There isn't like a sequential order it has to go in. But at the same time, you can kind of introduce some more structure so you're not going off on a crazy realm. And that's kind of what we've tried to do with a lot of our work.
Yeah, no, I noticed actually you bounded it quite well, because I did ask it some pretty tough questions, right? The patient, I was like, look, you might be screwed. Like you might not be making out of this one. And it responded like, oh, well, that's not good. Well, hopefully I can kind of survive. And I just thought that was pretty interesting how I was able to handle that kind of questioning, even though I purposely tried to lead it off course to see how flexible it was. So that was definitely a really impressive application of technology. And would you be able to touch on the actual like data literacy standards of doctors today so far, and how you see that evolving into the future?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's a huge range. I think there's some people that are absolutely experts, and they're incredible. They're people I look up to, and they're people I try to learn from. Um, and then, obviously, there's people that are like towards the end of their careers, and there's not really an incentive to them to kind of learn this new technology. So if maybe they started practicing when things were still being written down on paper. Like you put your order in for medication and they had to write it down and run it to the pharmacy. Now everything is on this electronic health record. And so it's the landscape of how we do medicine has changed so much. So if I personally, like if I was at the end of my career, I wouldn't be incentivized to learn a lot of this stuff. So I mean, I guess overall, to answer the question, I mean, I think it ranges quite a bit from people that are absolute experts. I've mentioned a couple of people previously. I think the biggest name is Eric Topol, which I had mentioned to you guys, who he's just kind of a leading voice, I would say, just in the medical field. He has some really great ideas, and a lot of people look to him when there's new technology or a new paper comes out, because he's someone that can interpret it to a high level where everyone can kind of listen and learn from it. So yeah, in conclusion, big range.
And I assume it varies by the sector than the healthcare industry, right? I mean, maybe like or the specialty. The radiologist might need to be more well versed in data than other types of doctors, I assume.
Yeah, I mean, and there's so many different applications, right? So in radiology, people are really trying to automate like reading of X-rays, reading of radiographs, and that's so they're obviously super familiar with that realm, right? But then, in the realm of surgery, people are trying to, what we're trying to do in our lab is to identify high-risk patients before they go into surgery, and identify people who would have an adverse outcome following surgery before they even have the surgery, which would ultimately allow us to potentially mitigate those risks. So one of my colleagues, Carson Gale, he uses this database called All of Us, and All of Us is it's a United States-based electronic health record database. What they've done that's very unique is they've actually been able to collect genetic data from millions of patients who have contributed, which is a really cool thing. Ultimately, what that allows you to do is you can now associate. Previously, you'd maybe associate, hypertension, pre-operative hypertension with a post-operative stroke risk. But now you could say, oh, a patient has this genetic mutation, and now you can identify that genetic mutation as causing an adverse event post-operatively. So what this will allow us to do is like really look on a granular level and identify patients that could potentially be affected by a bad surgical outcome before it even happens.
That's pretty cool. What you're talking about sounds a lot more like personalized healthcare. Where do you see, that's basically what it is. Where do you see AI going in that realm?
Yeah, that's kind of my dream is that personalized healthcare. I don't know how far away it is. I think maybe technically it's not as far as we'd think, but I think to actually implement those things becomes a little bit different, because people are constantly coming up with you know calculators, right? Like risk calculators. It's super common. People use different algorithms, and then what you can do is you can input a patient's age, you can put a patient's like comorbidities. So do they have hypertension? Do they have diabetes? Do they have a history of depression? And then you can put in race, you can put in all these different things. And ultimately, that will personalize a lot. And now that I talk about this All of Us program that incorporates genetic information, I mean, ideally, like my dream one day would be to have a calculator that would be able to put in massive amounts of a patient's health information and give like a true risk assessment for that patient. And I think like there's so many different factors that you have to consider that we don't always have access to. Like the genetic component to me, I think is unbelievable. Like we've identified a specific allele that is associated with post-operative atrial fibrillation. Like that is incredible. Now, what if you're able to do that on a much larger scale? And I think that's just it'll happen, but it certainly will take time. And when you talk about personalized medicine, I don't think it gets much better than that.
Yeah, no, where does it stop? There's continuous monitoring. You can have people's watches continuously monitoring what's happening with them, running algos on that. And then I think the real promise in that is probably actually handing the power of healthcare over to the patients as well. Instead of just, the doctor being completely responsible for someone's health. Now you have basically the patient themselves actually a lot more responsible for their own health, but also impact things like treatment compliance, things like that, right?
No, it's an outstanding point, and even you mentioned like the wearable devices. I mean, those
Mm.
are continuous monitors that have
Yeah,
infinite amounts of data. And actually, all of us started to incorporate wearable information into their database. So when you talk about like that continuous monitoring, that's just so much
yeah.
information. But like you were saying, there's this level of like who owns the data, and like the patients can maybe take back some of their autonomy with that data. So that's kind of the battle and the logistic issues or things that exist currently.
Oh, incredibly interesting.
Yeah, I think when you mention these kind of really sophisticated AI systems, my head immediately goes to the data systems behind them, right? Like the complexity in capturing all these data sources, unifying it across different hospitals, across different countries, right? I mean, you might not be able to have access to that. Are there any open data standards right now that are available in the medical space at the moment that would kind of alleviate that issue?
Yeah, that's kind of where everything is trying to go. I think a centralized, standardized data source would change how we do research entirely, especially like just the clinical data. Um, I think so. With COVID, I mentioned that national COVID cohort collaborative. Previously, it was really, really tough to find like a national that they exist, but they weren't as like kind of robust and technologically sound as national COVID cohort collaborative. There are a couple of reasons for that. Obviously, there was a national or international health crisis that was putting pressure on um, our health system to produce research to better understand the SARS-CoV-2 virus. Um, and so as a result, we were able to like actually produce the centralized data source that was powered by Palantir, which is just an incredible data company in the United States that they produced an incredible platform. And the research that could be conducted on there was pretty much had never been seen before. However, the stipulation was that it had to be COVID-19 related research. So we have the technology and we have the ability to do these things, but like I was saying previously, the logistics of actually producing such a data set are something that people are still kind of trying to wrestle with. And then there's a lot of different barriers to that I personally don't always I'm not entirely aware of. We actually had a lab meeting yesterday about talking about a database located in Wisconsin. So there's localized ones too. It was called Wishin. But he was kind of mentioning some of the barriers and the legal issues. I kind of asked, as you just said, this may be a naive question, but like, what are the legal barriers? Because in my head, I'm like, why wouldn't people want data to be centralized and we can all do this? But I do think there's a lot of reasons why people wouldn't want that. For example, like insurance companies, if there is centralized data of their how much they're charging and how much that can be complicated, and which is maybe one of the reasons why some of this stuff doesn't happen.
And I assume there's not much of a financial incentive for them either to kind of open source their data or make it centralized through this kind of repository.
Exactly. Yeah. Money will drive data. So
Money will drive data. Yeah, it's expensive to gather, it's expensive to store, so I understand why. Yeah, I mean
exactly.
that's a major theme in the AI data space is the question of decentralization versus centralization, right? I mean, you have major companies like Meta, OpenAI, and whatnot that are centralizing tons of data and who are able to train these really sophisticated models. Trying to replicate that in the healthcare industry will be a major concern, obviously. What can you touch on about the different healthcare systems and how they might alleviate those symptoms? So, for example, a U.S. system, which is typically seen as more decentralized, privatized industry and whatnot, or the UK system, which has a centralized NHS, would those types of systems help in creating like this like major database of data about patients and whatnot?
Yeah, so you touched on it. The United States has a decentralized electronic health records versus and I think that I don't know for sure, but largely I do think that just comes down to how our health system's set up. It's privately owned. Um, a lot of the European countries have the centralized health system where all that data, I think maybe owned by the government, or there's some level of government like intervention within that. And so as a result, a lot of really like studies that we are not able to do in the United States will come out of European countries, and those are studies that will generate a lot of different conversation and discussion in the United States. I can't think of a study in particular, but I just know when those do come out, they're usually really, really high impact because they oftentimes are accessing data that we do not have access to in the United States. So it's definitely something to just like, that's a huge difference between our countries and how we do research. Is sometimes when a European country does come out with research, I can think of like Sweden and the UK, typically when they come out with a study, it's extremely high impact for things we do in the United States, even just because we aren't able to conduct the same type of research at times.
That's interesting. I was wondering why Scandinavian countries come out with so many papers, in particular related to like psychology and stuff. I was like, why is it always Scandinavian countries? Now it makes sense, right? It's a centralization of the healthcare systems that enable them to gather the data they need. Okay, that's great. Well, I'm
Yeah,
happy.
and
Sorry, go ahead.
well, I was just gonna say, I'm very curious, like so in the United States, we have a bunch of different electronic health record like systems. So we have Epic, which is probably, I think it's one of the biggest ones, and it's located actually in Wisconsin, which is really cool. But I know that there are plenty of others nationwide that also have a huge stake of that market. Oh, how does that work? Are you aware of how that works in the UK?
Shab, do you want to take this one?
Not an expert, but from talking to the medics, the way that it seems to me is that data, information, and innovation even is siloed between trusts. So a trust would have, let's say, 3 or 4 hospitals which they manage, and that's very siloed and different to the other trusts, which are different hospitals. Which, from an outsider perspective, I actually don't understand why it works that way, because it means that there's a lot less, innovation that goes between trusts. So that's just my 2 cents on it. Of
I
course,
also know the data sharing standards kind of like inhibited inventory management as well. So you might have like one hospital somewhere in the UK right next to another one. They wouldn't actually know how much inventory of certain goods they would have, so they wouldn't be able to share between each other. So even if the system is centralized in the UK, it seems like the data standards are not really up to par when it comes to that. And that's something that they would probably have the power as a centralized entity to do, and might be something worth addressing in their case. But I mean, obviously, another point to make with the US system is as a financial incentive. As far as I could look at the US system, it seems like hospitals are competing with each other for patients. So they're actually trying to provide the best healthcare and best experience possible. I mean, can you touch on that at all in terms of like how hospitals will leverage themselves on a better experience? Is it mostly just like the design of the hospital, the user experience, like walking through the hallway? How does that work?
Yeah, I mean it's a really interesting observation. I think there's a lot of different components to it. I think on one end, yeah, like you were saying, we compete with other hospitals. So the Milwaukee Bucks, the NBA team, I'm a big fan, but also one of the coolest parts is they're sponsored by the Medical College of Wisconsin, where I go to school. So now their name is being, thrown all over the place, all over national TV, because it's brand recognition now. It's like, I'm gonna go to Fredericton, the Medical College of Wisconsin, for my healthcare. So now that there's a lot of advertising for going to different healthcare systems. And so if I'm just watching TV, I mean, there are a lot, I would say at least 25% of commercials are a hospital. So they're talking about some sort of hospital, or it's a drug advertisement, which I understand. I don't think they have in the UK. Maybe they do.
That is
this
correct.
sounds completely alien to me. Completely alien.
You do not have it?
No, we don't even have adverts for particular hospitals. For us, it's just goes to local.
Perhaps the most corrupt part of it is probably the drug advertisements, right? Because you're advertising medications to people that are not doctors, that don't understand the medication. And then, I think it almost, at times, it takes advantage of people who could potentially be desperate, right? Like, let's say I have like a super bad cancer, a metastatic cancer, and I'm willing to do anything to get it treated, right? And so now I see a commercial that says, this medication has been shown to improve patients who have metastatic lung cancer. Well, I hear that. I didn't read the research. I'm not a physician, but now I'm going to try to get that drug. Now you wouldn't be able to get the drug without a physician's approval. You'd have to actually go to the doctor, and the doctor would have to have an indication to actually give you that medication. But still, it's just like, I think you're toying with people's psyche, and potentially like the most vulnerable people we have in our population are people who are really sick. And like, I think I don't feel great about that, because I of people who are vulnerable, and it's just not a great place to be in. I think there's a lot of people who agree with that in the United States, but just how we're set up right now, we can advertise our medications, and the slogan. So like, I'll hear a song. I know, oh, that's Biktarvy, or that's name whatever like diabetes drug. I know the diabetes drugs based on their advertisement music, which is like, it's a crazy thing.
I guess bringing it back to personal healthcare, personalized healthcare, even maybe that's something that could actually help with this. Actually informing patients more about their own healthcare, so they're actually more aware of themselves. They track their own, metrics and everything. So maybe that could actually be a solution to things like this.
Yeah, and I think even just there's people are kind of approaching AI as a WebMD now, and I think that's pretty obvious. I mean, we've done that with Google for a while. I mean, if you had an ache or pain in your chest, let's say, you're gonna Google like, why do I have chest pain? The first thing that's gonna come up is heart attack.
Yep.
Like, so, and I think a lot of people are saying, oh, like, Chat GPT as a diagnostician is dangerous. I, my thought is that, it's not necessarily as dangerous as like, it's pretty much the equivalent of Google. It's just going to work a little bit better, and people can
Yep.
ask follow-up questions. And so I do think like I'm a huge proponent. Like I tell all my patients, you're ultimately the driver of your health. We can do everything we can to help you, but ultimately you will decide whether or not you're going to have a good outcome, whether or not you continue to take this medication that's going to keep you out of the hospital. So ultimately, if we give patients more autonomy by allowing them to access these materials that that they ordinarily wouldn't have or haven't had previously before some of these generative AI diagnosticians have come out, I think it's potentially a really good thing.
This reminds me of something that you talked about last time. You talked about Stanford rolling out a HIPAA compliant GPT. So yeah, how do you see that being integrated in things like medical training and even interaction with patients?
Yeah, so Stanford was the first one that I saw who had created a HIPAA. I don't know if you guys have HIPAA, but you probably have some form of it. It just basically protects patient information. So we have like a HIPAA compliance that we have to follow. Essentially, we don't allow patient data to leak out into the public or in spheres that it shouldn't be. But with ChatGPT, like I can't just put in patient information, because that's going to go to their servers, and they'll have access to that. So and I don't know technically how they did it, but yeah, Stanford put out a HIPAA compliant chat GPT that people at their institution can use. And I thought that was such a great idea, because everyone's going to use chat GPT for in their everyday life. And I think that'll only become more prevalent, especially in medicine. Because what I like to use it for is when I'm looking for the zebra, or that's what I call it, like the zebra, the patient who things are not adding up. And with all of the clinical knowledge I have access to, it's not, I can't come up with a diagnosis. So it helps as like a diagnostic supplement, where I can say, this patient has this really weird rash, and their eyes has like, their right eye has some nystagmus. And so I'm trying to put together these pieces, and I'm not able to do it, but I at least have like the expertise to kind of get it to that point. So what this allows us to do is just, I think more, or what the Stanford Chat GPT does is it helps their system be more HIPAA compliant. It stops people who are probably going to make HIPAA violations accidentally. Like it does happen. I think they're actually probably getting ahead of it, and by adopting this technology, being the first ones to adopt it and create a chat GPT that's protected, I think is an outstanding idea. I'm sure that's going to become extremely common in every healthcare system. And actually, I know that Epic in Epic, the electronic health record, which is probably the biggest in the United States, is actually trying to produce their own that would be built into the electronic health record. So they'll actually have their own ChatGPT built into where we do all of our work, which would probably, I don't know the extent of it. One, maybe it can access like some of the things more broadly, but even being able to search for different things within a patient's chart, that would be simplified quite a bit by just being able to have it query throughout all of someone's patient records. So
Interesting.
It seems like realistically, the initial implementation of AI in healthcare is going to be through the doctor, right? I mean, I think it'll be more of an assistant to the doctor as opposed to the patient himself interfacing with it, because he would have no understanding of what's coming out as right. And I don't think we'd be comfortable with the doctor kind of, not having his opinion in whatever diagnosis we're given. Is that kind of how it's fleshing itself out to be?
yeah, I think isn't there a rule they call like the 5% rule or something, where basically chat or just AI and robots generally can do everything up until the last 5%. I don't think ChatGPT can do, like 95% of a doctor's job yet, but I think that idea will always probably remain where, maybe they give you that diagnosis. ChatGPT gives you that diagnosis, and it still takes like someone with expertise to say like, yes, this is correct, or no, this is not correct. And we've seen that with I was talking about the radiographs earlier, when someone gets an X-ray and you can have these image processing um, models that can identify pathology. Well, ultimately that needs to be overseen by a human, because there will always be mistakes, and humans make mistakes too. But ultimately having that expert viewing that at the end of the day will always probably exist. So I don't know. I think that 5% rule will probably always apply. Even I don't think we'll. I don't know. I don't want to say this, but maybe I don't know that we'll ever have robots doing surgeries, but we do have robots controlled by humans doing surgeries. Anything's possible, but ultimately there will always be that 5% where you can't fully trust a robot in the event that something goes wrong. There has to be that human intervention to like take over and fix the issue.
It's interesting you brought trust. You used the word trust. I think when it comes to algorithms, AI, people inherently have less trust when it comes to that versus a human. So yeah, I was just going to ask, like, what sort of misconceptions or concerns do you actually see from people in the use of AI when it comes to healthcare?
Yeah, you mentioned trust, but then you also mentioned there is like a human component to medicine, which I'd argue is maybe the most important. So I think a lot of patients will come in with like diseases that are going to be treated with a pretty straightforward regimen. Like it's pretty obvious how their treatment course is going to go. There's not much of our intervention that's going to change it. We maybe identify what's wrong, but we're going to treat them and they're going to like get better. Like there's a much bigger component of it when you come to someone who is battling something out in their outside life, where maybe they're homeless, maybe they're dealing with substance use issues, and then that becomes a little bit more complicated, because now you are treating them for, say, heart failure, but then they also have so much stuff going on in their outside life. So how are we able to manage a lot of those different things, and even motivate them? So like, we're taught motivational interviewing, identifying reasons for why someone should like implement some behavior thing. So the classic is like smoking cigarettes. So you always want to ask these open-ended questions, like why, like, how do you feel about smoking? And maybe they're like, I know it's bad for me. And you say, well, it's bad for you. So they have the knowledge that's bad for you. Like, why haven't you stopped? And maybe they'll say, oh, well, I don't know. I just feel like I need it. Well, let's say you tried to stop. Like on a scale of 1 to 10, how strong do you think that you'd be able to actually follow through on it? And maybe they say, like a 6. Well, then you ask, well, why? Like why? You say a 6, which is low. It's higher than a 1, but it's not a 10. Why? Like why aren't you at a 10? And then they'll disclose something. So like that type of conversation is, I think it takes a human component. because I think we relate to one another. We all understand, like, I feel like I'm a pretty disciplined person, but there are plenty of things I'd like to implement in my life that I just can't do. And so I can relate to that person who is having a hard time smoking versus, I think that last component of with like, large language models, AI, there's just this level of it's not a human, so ultimately people don't trust it as much. I think people hear about data and they hear about Big Brother and they read books like 1984. I don't know if you guys have read that, but like there's this level of being watched and that your data is being collected, and I think I don't know if it's culture, I don't know if it's movies, but we definitely feel like there's this impending doom as a result of AI, and whether or not that's true remains to be seen. I'm not an expert. I can't comment on that, but I think those are some reasons why people maybe don't trust it.
There was
Uh,
a paper I was reading that I thought was quite interesting, which was in researching for this podcast episode, in that they had two patients who were recovering from roughly the same disease, and well, not two patients, a sample of patients, and they put one patient in like a room which was quite dark, quite dim, and another one in the room which was facing nature. And generally, the people who were facing nature tended to heal faster. So there's definitely a psychological component to your healing progress and whatnot. And I'm interested in how much human empathy plays into that loop, right? Because that's something that I think AI systems are very far away from replicating. Even if they do, I mean, I'm speaking for myself here. It comes off as extremely shallow. I mean, you try talking to ChatGPT about something like mental health problems you're having, it'll be like, "I understand. This is XYZ on Wikipedia," and it feels like you're talking to a robot because you are. How much of that comes into play in treating a patient?
Yeah, I think that's a huge. I mean, you bring up that or some research, and that's like totally true. I think we have a rule in our hospital that every hospital room has to have a window
Mm.
that faces the outside. So it's clearly super super important. And then even if you walk into a children's hospital, the colors, the way everything's set up is extremely purposeful. Like there's engineers who design it in a particular way because it does lead to better outcomes. Um, I know, like there has been people who have created they've created websites, whatever, that are like AI therapists.
mm,
But like you're saying, I mean, they'll affirm what you are feeling, but ultimately they won't. You're still lacking that human component. So
mm.
I still think there's a lot of room for that in so many different ways. And that's why a lot of people talk about medicine as an art. They call it the art of medicine. And like I think while we have a lot of diagnostic algorithms and treatment algorithms that could very easily be applied into AI, ultimately like the way we treat is much more human than artificial. So
Oh, let me play devil's advocate for you there then. When we're talking about the integration of AI into healthcare, I would argue that there's also avenues of implementing AI which would actually increase the amount of the human touch that you would have in healthcare. We mentioned last time, similar to Eric Topol's stance on the thing. If we had AI, which could potentially lower your administrative workloads, then that would actually allow you more time to actually talk to the patient face to face. If you didn't have to sit there and concentrate on capturing every aspect of the patient interaction, you could actually spend more time with the patient, right? So there are ways of implementing AI which doesn't try and replicate the emotional side of things, but actually, supplements it. So what do you think about that?
I absolutely am on board with that. I think that's maybe the place that we will see first. The place we will integrate AI first within medicine will be note taking. It will be in writing discharge summaries.
Mm,
There's still a level of importance in that because the notes ultimately are our chance to show our diagnostic reasoning. So I think the patient has some form of anemia because of this. However, it also could be a blood cancer because of this. So I like write out my reasoning. Now, like me writing that out takes time. And like you were saying, it takes time away from the patient. And that's what Eric Topol talks about so much is what AI will ultimately do is make our work lives more efficient, and ultimately we'll be able to spend more time with patients. Even as a medical student, where we're supposed to have the most time with patients, I find I didn't spend as much time with patients as I would have liked. As a student, you have to write some notes, and we're not super efficient in writing our notes, so it takes me a couple hours. And if I were able to use AI to write those notes, for example, I could dictate things like I was doing previously, but now it doesn't have to be structured. If I make a mistake, like the AI will actually, correct for that. But then there's also what you were talking about as well, is like, the recording systems, where if I'm actually sitting down and having the conversation with the patient, you can record that entire conversation. It's going to be completely unstructured text, but then the beauty of and I think one of the best use cases is taking the unstructured text and turning it into a structured note, which saves the clinician time. It allows the patient to just have a better experience. Where I'm sure if you guys go to the doctor, you'll see the doctor will be sitting, and if you're lucky, they'll be facing you, but they'll be typing the entire time. And that's not how medicine was supposed to be. And I do think that like we have the potential to go back to that. And I'm hoping that once I'm working 80 hours a week in residency, that transition happens, because I do not want to be writing that many notes.
I guess it's useful for you as well, isn't it?
I have lots of stake in this, so anything you guys can do to speed this up, that would be greatly appreciated.
I think, like you mentioned, Epic is working on a HIPAA compliant GPT as well. So yeah, I think these pipelines are definitely in the works there.
Yeah, and what's actually really cool is that, the the actual geographical closeness or vicinity that you have to these big systems allows you to have access to it sooner. So I know that UW-Madison, University of Wisconsin-Madison, which is it's the other medical school within the state of Wisconsin. It's about 20 minutes from Epic. And so anytime Epic creates a new a new something within their electronic health record database, they'll be the first ones to beta test it, which is awesome. So I'm very jealous of them for that reason.
Have you seen any of this impacting like your medical studies?
You referencing the like the listening, or just what
Just
exactly?
I was actually referencing like AI chatbots. So I was actually transitioning more towards ChatClinic. So AI companions would actually help you while you're actually learning instead.
Yeah, I think, yeah, there's so many different examples of where it's helpful. One that I'm doing more of, so I created ChatClinic, right, which is, like it simulates patient interaction. And really what this does is we miss out on true patient interaction in the first year and second year of med school. We call those like the pre-clinical years, where we're not actually interacting with patients. So we just are learning a lot of knowledge, but don't actually know how to apply it. So that's kind of why we started ChatClinic. And what ChatClinic does is it actually allows those patients, or those students rather, in their first and second years to interact with patients, develop their clinical gestalt, um, before they actually even enter the hospital. Which, I think for me, like when I came up with this idea, it was because I was lacking that interaction with patients. And while I felt like I knew a lot, I didn't know how to actually apply it. So when I'd go to clinic, sometimes I'd be scratching my head. I'd be asking a patient about their cough, but wouldn't really know what question to ask next. Like you don't, for example, like someone with a cough, you're not like, oh, what's your diet been like? And that's just like, that's not a great question to ask, because it's very likely their diet is not causing their cough. So creating those questions that you want to ask someone when they present with abdominal pain, when they present with a cough, you create questions in your head and like differential diagnoses. And ultimately, the only way you're able to create those is with repetition. So in those first 2 years, without the repetition, you're not going to actually develop those thought processes. And so that's ultimately what ChatClinic does, is it tries to integrate that preclinical knowledge into clinical knowledge, and gives you the repetitions to become a good doctor ultimately.
Nice. And that's something like where this can go potentially is something that Alex touched on earlier actually. Like you've been talking about empathy and the human touch being like really important in these patient interactions. Do you want to flesh out where you see this sort of tech going in the future to basically train medical students?
Yeah, I think for us, we want to improve its ability to simulate interaction. So we want to actually improve the learning component of it, where we're able to draw on the exact treatment protocol for this patient. So at the end of the interaction, you give your assessment and plan. So I tell the patient, based on my clinical history taking and based on the X-ray that I had and the sputum culture, you have pneumonia, and we're going to be treating it with uh, amoxicillin or something, right? And when you do that, there's levels that, like, you can get the feedback from the ChatClinic, but ChatClinic is not drawing on like our true source of knowledge. And I think that's like ultimately our goal is how do we feed in information through, there's a lot of different techniques you can do for that, but how can we feed in like the source of truth into ChatClinic to ultimately like give people the truest sense of the most up-to-date treatments for whatever condition we're simulating? Because currently it's just going to draw in whatever it thinks it knows, and a lot of times it's probably not what you actually do in the hospital. So I think making that actual the feedback a little bit more robust will add to its like teaching ability and educational value, which I mean, I think that's ultimately our goal, and we'll see where it goes, because we have a lot of traction right now, which has been, I mean, it's been awesome just to see the interest. And like, it was awesome when you guys reached out. I thought it was cool, like that had a further reach than I had initially ever really thought. So we're continuing to just try to improve things, and we've had people reach out that like want to collaborate, and and I think that's been also something that's been crazy about this whole thing is, I don't have like finances to hire a software engineer. I don't have finances to produce like a tutorial video. So while there's been a lot of focus on just like learning the AI sphere, I've learned so much about like leadership and learning how to manage different teams and manage different personalities. And my co-founder, thankfully, is a software engineer, so I can talk with him a lot about the technical components of it, and he's the one that can execute. And so that's just incredible to work with someone like that, because I personally learn a lot from him. But then, on the flip side, one of the things we struggled with initially was actually getting the product in front of people and having them understand how to use it. And because unless you're really familiar with how these systems work, these like large language models work and how you interact with them, people struggle to actually use the product. So I had reached out to a local high school regarding, because they had a media class, and the media class was interested in like outside groups that had companies, and they wanted to create a project. So what I did is I proposed my project to them, and I basically led their project. I was like their project lead for the course of 8 weeks, and we met weekly. And um, it was a really cool experience for me, because like interacting with high school kids is a completely different challenge, right? Like, they're not, some of them are super motivated and some aren't super motivated, and how do you balance that? And I mean, ultimately they were the ones that created the tutorial video that really ended up getting or getting us a ton of institutional interest for ChatClinic, which is so cool that like high school students created the video that ultimately like put us on a bigger platform. So that's just been a cool thing to be a part of, and I'm just kind of along for the ride at this point, and we'll see what happens.
I think
Honestly,
you.
exciting stuff. No,
Sorry.
sorry, Alex. Go on.
All good, all good. I think you touched on something quite interesting in terms of actually iterating upon these systems and improving them, right? There's an aspect of like implementing evaluation metrics, which I think in traditional machine learning is a lot more simple. It usually comes down to a single binary number or continuous value. But when it comes to with large language models, the evaluation metrics are a lot more abstract, right? It's mostly like feedback from a real person interacting with it or another large language model evaluating it. Is that something you've considered or thought about? Like, how would you iterate upon the system? How would you gather data from people who are interacting with it to improve it?
You guys should have went to medical school. You're doing all my projects. One of the projects we had done was an evaluation project. So we took 3 conditions: cholecystitis, which is inflammation of your gallbladder; appendicitis, inflammation of your appendix; and then the third was diverticulitis. So it's inflammation of an outpouching of your colon. And those were the 3 conditions that ChatClinic simulated. And then I interacted with them with a standardized like history taking protocol that I'd created. Ultimately, the transcripts were reviewed by 5 faculty surgeons at Medical College of Wisconsin, and then 3 different large language models. And then it was evaluated on a scale of 1 to 5, and I think we evaluated based on like comprehension, reasoning, potential for harm and bias. And it was very interesting because I do not think evaluating ChatClinic performance using, Llama or even like ChatGPT, evaluating ChatGPT is not, it doesn't work for a lot of different reasons. So ultimately, what a lot of people have done, regardless of domain, is look for domain experts, human experts, to review the output. But without a standard evaluation protocol, that it's really difficult to do. So everyone is kind of scrambling. How best do we evaluate the performance of these things? So you were spot on, like asking that question. The reality is there isn't a good answer right now. People have proposed different techniques of doing it, but ultimately we need someone to come up with like a consensus regarding this. And I think that's hopefully some of the work I'll do this fall, in developing a consensus for medical uses.
Right. So Shab, do you want to wrap up with the last kind of 2 open-ended questions?
Yeah, go on then. So this is just really have no constraints of time, money, expertise, or anything. Very long-term vision. You can talk very broadly. How do you see healthcare in, like, let's say 2030? What is your vision for how healthcare would look if we were able to integrate AI as you see fit?
Yeah, there's a lot of different components. I think on the first, I'll think about it in a couple ways. The first way would be just time saving or time efficiency. We already kind of touched on it, but I think if we were able to create safe structures that both patients and healthcare systems felt comfortable with, in terms of recording conversations, clinical conversations, and ultimately taking that unstructured text and changing it into a clinic note, to me would be absolutely game changing. I think one, hopefully they wouldn't make us see more patients, because that would just add complexity to our day. But really, my hope would be that by implementing that technology, we're able to actually give higher quality care. Every patient would like to have more time with their doctor, and ultimately, I think this is one potential solution for that. I think the second component that I think is important is personalized care. So I mentioned it previously, and I think it's pretty far off as a pipe dream, but like if we were able to personalize everyone's care and give a true risk assessment for surgery, something I'm interested. I plan on going into ENT, had a neck surgery. So if we're able to look at a patient and, like I said, factor in age, sex, race, comorbidities, and then we could also factor in all of their genes and look at the specific allele, and it maybe this one allele is associated with XYZ outcome in patients with hypertension. Well, I think on one side we'd maybe associate that allele previously with that outcome, but to associate it with hypertension and older individuals that's a machine learning problem, in my opinion. And that type of personalization, I think, is like, it's coming, but I think it's super far off. And to me, that'd be incredible. And I think maybe the last component is just, I think there's so much logistic, I think logistically, when patients are going through healthcare, I think it's a terrifying thing. So kind of the third point would just be patient autonomy. So having systems, both technological systems and also like systems built within the healthcare system that would allow patients to seek out like clinical trials. That's one thing that we were trying to work on is can we train our own model to identify clinical trials and allow patients to like seek out the trials that maybe they wouldn't know that they're eligible for, and maybe they don't have hope in their whatever disease they have. So I think like, and then ultimately, you know, let's say they have a new symptom that comes up. I think like them going to these AI diagnosticians and at least helping them screen themselves. Like, is this lump something to be worried about? Is this headache? You know, what are things I should be worried about with my headache so I'm not having like a stroke? I think that gives so much autonomy back to patients. I think that's like a huge area that AI can really, you know, improve healthcare as a whole and for both patients and physicians.
Right.
Oh, I love that vision for the future. Thanks, Nate.
Yeah,
Thank you.
mate.
You've been amazing.
Yeah, mate, you are an inspirational guy. You meet a few people in your life where you're like, okay, you know, my faith in humanity is slowly restoring itself, and maybe the healthcare sector is now sorted. So I'm happy to see that it's in good hands. So hopefully you can come up with something pretty interesting. I hope to see more of you soon in the future.
We're excited to see what comes out of a ChatClinic over the next couple of years.
I greatly appreciate the kind words, and yeah, hopefully you know me for ChatClinic, but hopefully you also know me for I don't know, treating patients well. I think that's the goal.
Awesome.
100%. All right. Thank you, Nate.
Thanks, guys.